Story 1. The House of Corpses. On the outskirts of the city, there stood an abandoned house, long forgotten by time. The townsfolk avoided it, warning that anyone who entered never came out. Some claimed to hear screams from inside at night, while others swore they saw figures lurking in its broken windows. No one could say for certain what lay within, but the rumors alone were enough to keep the house undisturbed for decades. One evening, two friends, Ethan and Jack, decided to enter the house. They were amateur filmmakers who recorded urban explorations for their online channel. If they could capture something supernatural, their video would go viral. They had explored abandoned buildings before, but none with a reputation like this one. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the stench of rot filled their lungs. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling to reveal dark stains beneath. The entire house felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for them. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that made the ears ring, as if something had sucked all the sound out of the air. Even their footsteps felt muted. As they explored, they noticed strange drawings on the walls, crude sketches of distorted faces, their eyes hollow and mouths twisted in silent screams. Some of the drawings overlapped, as though someone had repeatedly scrawled over them, desperate to capture something they had seen. But the most disturbing part was the smell. It was getting stronger, the scent of something long dead. A sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps from the upper floor. Ethan and Jack froze. They turned their cameras toward the staircase, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. Then, without warning, the front door slammed shut behind them. The house had trapped them inside. "Let's get out of here," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. But as they turned to leave, they realized the door had vanished. It wasn't just locked. It was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Ethan ran his hands over the surface, his breath quickening. It was wood, just like the rest of the house, as if the doorway had never existed. Their flashlights flickered. The air grew thick, pressing against their chests. Then from the hallway, a whisper, "I see you." They ran upstairs, hoping to find another way out. But what they found was worse. A room filled with photographs, hundreds of them, scattered across the floor and pinned to the walls. Each photo showed a different person, all staring directly at the camera. Some were faded, others fresh, as if taken moments ago. The expressions varied. Some faces were blank, others twisted in fear. Then Ethan gasped. One of the photos was of him, another was of Jack. Their images had been added to the collection. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You are mine now." A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and humanly thin, with a face that looked like melted wax. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Jack screamed and ran. Ethan followed, but the thing was faster. The walls stretched, the hallways twisted, the house itself shifting to keep them inside. Doors led to nowhere. Stairs looped back on themselves. There was no way out. A cold hand gripped Ethan's shoulder. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, the house stood silent once more. No trace of the boys remained, except for two new photos on the wall, their faces frozen in eternal horror. Their cameras lay abandoned on the floor, their batteries drained, the footage corrupted. And yet, every so often, a passerby would swear they heard voices within, faint, pleading whispers calling for help. The house was still hungry, and it was waiting for the next visitor, waiting for... Story 2. The Cursed Doll. Omar had always been drawn to the past. He loved collecting antiques, hunting through dusty markets and forgotten shops for relics with history. One afternoon, he found himself in a tiny, dimly lit antique store tucked away in an alley. Shelves crowded with trinkets lined the walls. The scent of aged wood and old paper heavy in the air. As he examined an ornate pocket watch, something else caught his eye. A wooden doll sitting on a high shelf. It was small, no larger than a child's toy, with painted glassy eyes and a faint, unsettling smile carved into its lips. A peculiar chill ran through him. "That doll," the shopkeeper muttered, his voice oddly hesitant. "It should not be disturbed," Omar chuckled. "Curses and superstitions? Those are just stories. The shopkeeper didn't laugh. Some stories are warnings. Ignoring the man's unease, Omar purchased the doll and brought it home, setting it on a shelf in his bedroom. That night, strange things began happening. At first, it was minor. The air felt heavier. The shadows in the corners of his room seemed darker. The TV flickered once before turning off on its own. He heard faint whispers just as he was drifting off to sleep. Too soft to make out words, but unmistakably real. Then the doll moved. At first, he thought he was imagining it. He would place it on the shelf before bed, only to wake up and find it sitting on his desk. He dismissed it as forgetfulness. But the third night, he woke up in a cold sweat, feeling an unbearable weight on his chest. The doll was there, sitting on top of him, staring. Panic surged through him. Omar grabbed the doll and threw it into the garbage bin outside, shutting the lid with finality. He locked his doors and windows, assuring himself that it was over. But that night, as he lay in bed, just as sleep was about to claim him, he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft knocking at his bedroom door. His throat went dry. Slowly he sat up, staring at the door in the dim light. The tapping continued, steady, insistent. With trembling hands, he reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open. The doll sat in the middle of the hallway. Dread filled his veins. This wasn't possible. He had thrown it away. Yet here it was, back in his home, back in front of him. His mind screamed at him to get rid of it, permanently. He grabbed the doll and rushed to the fireplace, tossing it into the flames. The heat licked at the wooden figure, the glassy eyes reflecting the firelight. The plastic parts melted away. The wooden core blackened, cracked, then crumbled into ash. Omar stood over the flames, watching as it burned completely, feeling an immense relief wash over him. It was gone, or so he thought. That night, he awoke to a sound, so soft, so near. A whisper, right by his ear. "Why did you do that?" His breath caught in his throat. His body refused to move. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his head. The doll was there, lying beside him on the pillow. Its face had changed. No longer was it carved with a faint smile. Its mouth was open, revealing rows of tiny, jagged teeth. Before he could scream, it lunged. The next morning, Omar's apartment was eerily silent. His phone still lay on the nightstand, his half-eaten breakfast cold on the table. The door was locked from the inside, the windows untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of Omar at all. Only one thing remained. The doll. It sat neatly on the bed, its glassy eyes no longer lifeless. Now they glowed with something else, something alive. Story 3. Don't go into the forest after sundown. My husband and I live in a house that's somewhat secluded. Our neighbors aren't the type you can just say hi to over the fence, and a large, thick forest backs our property. For the past year that we have lived here, I have gone on a run along the forest path almost every morning. My husband likes to sleep in, whereas I've always enjoyed my early rises. Last week, we went to a friend's birthday party and were out late. I ended up sleeping in and missing my morning run. I had a few chores to do, and by the time 5 p.m. rolled around, I decided I wasn't going to miss my run that day. I stepped out onto the back porch and took a deep breath as the sun was beginning to set on the horizon. My husband stepped out and gave me a lazy smile before he kissed me on the cheek. I told him I'd be back before it was dark and headed off. It started off like any other run. I take the same path each day. It's a little overgrown, but still obvious enough and easy to follow. I was only about 10 minutes in, and I started to notice something. It was quiet, eerily quiet. Normally I can hear birds, leaves in the breeze, and bugs chirping. But it was just complete silence apart from my own breathing and heart beating in my chest. I found it creepy, but shrugged it off as something to do with the timing of the day. The next strange thing happened only a few minutes later. There's a part of the path that wraps around this massive gum tree, the type that you can't see around when you stand in front of it. Well, I reached that part of the path, and it was gone. Completely gone. Not like someone chopped it down and there was a stump or a hole in the ground left. It was like the tree never existed in the first place. There was grass and fallen leaves in its place. It looked like any other part of the forest floor. untouched for years. I was starting to get a bit freaked out. I run this path every day. I know this tree is meant to be here. I remember the first time I saw it, I was in awe at the size. I made my husband come for a walk with me the next day so I could show him too, and he was also impressed by the sheer scale of it. It didn't make any sense that it had quite literally vanished. Even if someone was going to chop it down, I wondered if it was even possible to do it in such a short amount of time. I only just saw it the day before on my usual morning run. The practical, logistic part of my mind came to the conclusion it must have been chopped down. I decided I would wait to talk to my husband about it when I got back, and maybe even bring him with me to have a look the next day. Maybe he would have an obvious answer that I was missing. Perhaps I could contact the council and ask them about it. I shook it off and continued along the path. As I continued running, I started to get this off feeling in my stomach. Something just didn't feel right, but I didn't know what it was. After a while, I noticed that the sun was setting. Fast. I was losing light quickly, which didn't make any sense. I only left at 5 p.m. The sun wasn't due to set until almost 7, and I had only been gone about 20 minutes. I looked at my watch, and sure enough, 5:23 p.m. I checked my phone, and it said the same. Just to be sure, I opened up the weather app and checked the sunset, 6:46 p.m. I was standing in almost darkness, staring at my phone in total confusion. I had no idea what was going on, and it was scaring the crap out of me. I knew the trees would make it dimmer than out in the open, but this was different. I decided enough was enough, and I was just going to cut my run short and head home. I turned around and began running back the way I came. After about another 10 minutes of running, I was stopped in my tracks and I felt my heart almost stop. There, standing on the path staring directly at me, was a moose. Those things are insanely huge. But the weirdest part about it all was, I live in Australia. We have just about every deadly animal on the planet, but we sure as hell don't have moose wandering around, and I certainly had never seen one in the last year I had been coming through the forest. I stared at this creature for what felt like an eternity, my heartbeat pounding in my head as my mind raced. It just stood there, eyes glowing in the dark, staring into my soul. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what I should do. Then after I felt like I was going to throw up from fear, it finally broke eye contact and just walked away. I stared as it strolled out of sight as if nothing had happened. Once I could no longer hear the footsteps and I was back in complete silence, I began sprinting. I was way too terrified to be in this forest a second longer than I had to be. I ran and ran until my lungs felt like they were going to give out. I thought for sure I should be reaching the clearing soon, but the more I ran, the more it felt like I went deeper and deeper into the woods. I glanced at my watch and my breath hitched. 9:42 p.m. It's not possible, I said to myself. It can't have been 4 hours. My whole interaction with the moose, although felt like forever, in reality only lasted a few minutes. I pulled out my phone, and again it matched what my watch said. I tried to call my husband, but I couldn't get any service. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. It was pitch black now, and I had to use my phone torch to illuminate the path. My mind was racing with some kind of way to come up with how this could be happening, but I had nothing. I decided all I could do was keep following the path and hope that soon enough I would come out and be home. I was exhausted from running for so long, so I walked for a while, constantly checking my phone to see if I got any reception to try and call somebody. I knew that I should have been out of the forest by now. I was trying my best to stay calm, but I was panicking internally. Suddenly, I froze with fear when I heard a deafening, guttural scream in the distance. I had never felt so sick in the stomach. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was about to pass out. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. It didn't sound human, but I couldn't think of any kind of animal that makes that noise either. I turned the flash off my phone. For some reason, standing in complete darkness felt safer to me at that moment. I didn't dare move as I intently listened for any more noise. Not a sound, not even a cricket or a breeze. The scream came from behind, and so I decided all I could do was keep moving and hopefully get further away. I'd heard online that mountain lions make terrifying screaming noises, but again, to the best of my knowledge, there are none in Australia and certainly not in my area. Either way, I was not interested in finding out, so I picked up my pace as I continued down the never-ending path. Then I heard it again. Only this time, it was much louder, meaning only one thing. It was getting closer. I broke into a full sprint, the adrenaline burst giving me the extra energy I didn't know I had. I ran for as long as I physically could before I had to slow down to catch my breath. I glanced at my watch again, 1:05 a.m. I let out a short laugh in disbelief. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples as I took a few deep breaths. I was too afraid to stay still, so I began walking again. The forest felt never-ending. There was no sign of a clearing or anything that looked familiar. No matter how much I moved, I just seemed to go deeper and deeper into the thick woods. I no longer even had a path. I was stepping over branches and bushes, trying my best not to trip. I was watching the ground for so long, I forgot to look ahead of me. And when I did, that was when I saw him. Or rather, it. Standing just a few meters from me, I could make out the figure of a pale person with their back facing me. I should have been thrilled to see another person, but for some reason their presence irked me. And right before I was about to blurt out something, I stopped myself. It was hard to make out many details in the dark. My eyes had somewhat adjusted, but from what I could see, he was just standing there, facing the other way, seemingly doing nothing. He looked bald, and I struggled to make out any clothes on his body. As I was studying him, that's when it happened. His head slowly turned until it was facing me. My breathing stopped when I saw its face. Instead of human eyes, it had two large black circles that looked like mini abysses. It had no nose and a mouth that matched its empty eyes. When I didn't think it could get more terrifying, the creature slowly began to stand, and I realized it was actually squatting initially. I watched in frozen terror as the creature's long, skinny legs came into view, right as it dropped its freakishly long, skinny arms at the same time. It must have been more than 10 feet tall. Once the creature had fully stood up, it turned towards me. I was too scared to move, to think, to breathe. All I could do was watch. It stared at me for a moment before dropping its jaw to let out the most unearthly, thunderous roar you could imagine. This was enough to snap me out of my frozen state of terror. I turned on my heel and sprinted in the opposite direction of the creature. My chest was burning as I ran as fast as I could. I refused to look behind me, but I could hear the thumping legs following behind me. I had no sense of direction, no plan. All I could do was run. I still couldn't see that well, and so I hadn't seen the edge until it was too late, rolling and toppling down a steep hill until I landed in the thick brush at the bottom. I groaned in pain, winded from the fall. I blinked a few times before looking up at the ledge I had just fallen from, where the creature suddenly appeared. My eyes widened and my heart raced as it looked around. I thought for sure this was it. There's no chance I can outrun this thing in my state. Just as I was reflecting on all the things in life I had missed out on, the creature turned away and walked back into the trees, out of sight. I let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding on to. The bushes must have swallowed me up enough so that it didn't see me. I checked my watch again. 4:59 a.m. After laying there for a few minutes to catch my breath, I slowly sat up, wiping the tears from my eyes as I could finally think for a moment. When I felt ready enough, I rose to my feet and looked around. I then noticed the path, a very familiar path. It was the one I ran every day. I began following it, hoping and praying with every step that my ordeal would finally be over. After a while, the forest started getting thinner, trees more spaced out, until finally I could see a clearing with light. I audibly gasped as I quickened my pace into a full sprint towards the opening, and when I came out on the other side, I could see the sunrise. Tears filled my eyes as I saw my house in the distance, and I continued running until I got to the back door. I burst into the house and saw my husband sitting in the living room with a mug in his hand. He turned and gave me a puzzled look when he saw me. "You all right?" he asked. I stared at him in disbelief. Why was he not more concerned? Why hadn't he been out looking for me? "Are you joking? I've been gone all night. I got lost and So many crazy things happened. The time went all weird and... All night? What are you talking about?" "You were gone for like 20 minutes, he responded, totally bewildered by my shouting. "But the sun is rising. I just saw it when I was coming back." I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "No, that's the sunset." He rose and came over to me, concern on his face. He pulled out his phone and pointed at the lock screen. Look, 5:24 p.m. You were gone for less than half an hour. Story 4. The Curse of the Snowman. The snowstorm arrived with an eerie silence, smothering the town of Black Hollow in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. It wasn't the first time the town had endured a brutal winter, but this storm felt different. The air was heavy, the sky an unsettling shade of gray, and the snowfall was relentless, piling up against houses like creeping waves. For the Holloway family, it was a weekend of warmth by the fire. John and his wife, Emily, along with their 2 children, Noah and Lily, watched as the world outside their windows disappeared beneath the storm's fury. With school canceled and roads impassable, the children were eager to play in the fresh snow. "Let's build a snowman," Noah suggested, his face alight with excitement. Despite Emily's hesitation, she helped bundle up the children, and the 3 of them ventured out into the quiet desolation of the storm. The streets were empty, their footprints the only marks on the untouched surface. The cold nipped at their faces, but Noah and Lily were undeterred as they began rolling snow into large, solid spheres. Lily was the first to notice something odd. "Noah, look at the snow. It's red." Noah frowned, brushing his mitten over the snow. It wasn't bright red, more like a faint pinkish hue, barely noticeable beneath the pristine white. Emily furrowed her brow, but before she could say anything, Noah shrugged it off. "It's just dirty snow," he said. "Let's keep building." They stacked the snowman's body, rounding out its shape until it towered over them. With pebbles for eyes and a jagged branch for a mouth, the snowman looked almost sinister, its misshapen grin stretching unnaturally wide. Noah insisted on using an old moth-eaten scarf they found in the garage, wrapping it around the snowman's neck like a noose. "Perfect," he said, stepping back. Emily felt uneasy. Something about the snowman felt wrong, but she forced a smile for the children. "All right, let's go inside and warm up." That night the storm raged on, the wind howling like a hungry beast outside their windows. John and Emily were in bed when they heard the first sound, a slow, deliberate scratching against the glass. Emily sat up, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" John groaned, half asleep. "Probably a tree branch." Another scratch. Longer this time, closer. Emily's breath hitched. She crept toward the window and pulled the curtain back. The snowman stood in the same spot, its eerie grin illuminated by the dim streetlight. But something was different. The pebbles that had been used for its eyes were gone. In their place, 2 hollow, empty sockets stared back at her. A shiver ran down her spine. The next morning, Noah and Lily rushed outside, but Emily hesitated. The unease from the night before hadn't faded. She cautiously followed them to the yard, her breath catching when she saw it. The snowman had moved. Not far, just a foot or 2, but the indent in the snow where it originally stood was undeniable. "Noah, did you move it?" Noah shook his head. "No way, it's too heavy." Emily tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind shifted it, or maybe the snowfall covered its tracks. But deep down, she knew better. That night, Emily dreamt of the snowman. It wasn't standing in the yard anymore. It was inside, standing at the foot of their bed, its mouth stretched wider, its jagged teeth made of ice. In the dream, she couldn't move, couldn't scream, as it reached out with long skeletal fingers made of brittle branches. She awoke with a start, gasping for air. But it wasn't just a dream. A trail of wet footprints led from the window to the side of her bed. John, now fully awake, grabbed a flashlight and baseball bat and rushed outside. The snowman was back in its place, but now it held something in its frozen grasp. Lily's scarf. Emily screamed, rushing back inside to check on the children. Lily was safe in her bed, but her room was ice cold, the window ajar despite being locked the night before. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. John decided to destroy the snowman. He swung the bat at its head, sending the misshapen grin flying into the snow. But as soon as it hit the ground, a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "Not enough." The voice was everywhere, wrapping around them like the wind. Emily grabbed the children and ran inside, bolting the doors. That night, the storm worsened. The howling wind carried whispers, soft but insidious. When morning came, the snowman was back, fully intact, standing even closer to the house. Noah and Lily wouldn't stop crying. They knew. They understood that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just snow. It was watching, waiting. John made a final decision. We're leaving. They packed what they could, braving the storm to get to the car. But as soon as they stepped outside, the snow beneath them gave way. A pit, deep and endless. Emily barely caught Lily's arm as she teetered on the edge. Noah screamed as something icy wrapped around his ankle, pulling him down. John grabbed his son, but the force was too strong. Noah disappeared into the darkness below, his screams swallowed by the void. Then silence. The snowman stood at the edge of the pit, its empty socket staring. It grinned wider, as if satisfied. By the time the authorities arrived, there was no sign of Noah. No pit, no snowman, just an endless expanse of untouched snow. The Holloways left town that night, never to return. And in the silent, frozen town of Black Hollow, the snowfall continued, piling higher, whispering secrets only the wind could hear. And somewhere, buried deep beneath the ice, the snowman waited for the next family to arrive.